presentation at annual conference, you brought up moral therapeutic deism, which is this really big term.
Yeah.
And I loved your description. It was a life coach and personal aid.
Psychologist, life coach,
there you go,
something like that.
So, I mean, the term comes out of this national study on youth and religion it started in 2001, and started surveying youth at that time who are, the millennial generation, and really walking with them through what it meant to be religious and looking at all different things. And so now a large portion of that study, the 39% of young adults that have now dropped out of attending church regularly, they are operating with this theology of this moral therapeutic deism of personal life coach and therapist. And I see this, for me at least, in what I'm thinking through is this is a planting issue. This is where we have not really done well at educating and discipling that generation. And so what do we do about this? I mean, we already have this generation that it isn't planted well. And how do we, as a church, work to reform maybe what we see as a shallow faith?
Right. I think at some point what happened was we kind of traded in the biblical story for some sort of nice moral vignettes to say this is how you're a good moral person, and we neglected the greater story of salvation. And I think that is sort of how you got that moral therapeutic deism, right? Is you have a God who is somewhat engaged only when you need him or when you need to learn how to be a better person, but he's not really doing anything in the background. God's not really active throughout history. It's just God is there when you need him. And so I think one of the things we need to have a return to is a picture of the larger biblical story, and putting the things that we learn about life and how to be Christians and how to live as Christians in the world, putting that back within the context of that larger story of salvation. I think the best example of that would be like the Ten Commandments. That you can take the Ten Commandments and you can teach them to a room full of people, right? And say, this is how you're a good person, or this is how you're supposed to live. And that makes sense to a certain degree, but when it's ripped out of its context of the story of this is God who brought you out of Egypt, and this is God who asked you to be in covenant with him, and these are your requirements for being in covenant, it doesn't make nearly as much sense, right? Yeah. And so I think if we have a return really to, first of all, like biblical literacy of teaching people not only individual stories as we're prone to do, but teach people sort of that grander picture of Genesis to Revelation, I think would really go a long way in helping with that. And I think the other part of that is, instead of trying to find what's relevant for people, right, and try to teach those moral things of like, well, this is how you can improve this area of your life, try to help people, young adults, even students, whoever, find the places where the contours of their life already intersect with the biblical story. Okay. Yeah. And say, this, is how this person's life went in Scripture, and your life seems to be at a similar place right now, And so let's talk about his story and how God interacted with that story, and what that might mean for your life, as opposed to just trying to like pull out little moral lessons. Yeah, and that I think gives them definitely a sense of connection. Then it's a lot easier to come into a story that has already been written than it is to just kind of say, well, here, let me place this on top of your experience. Right. I think that's an excellent way to look at it. And many have claimed that the professionalization of ministry, or having paid youth workers, paid staff people teach our children, has been one of the factors of this kind of shallowness of faith. It's not being taught in the home as much. Kids are being sent to church and teach there. So what's your, is that happening? What's your feeling about that? Yeah, I like that question because it's kind of provocative. Like, tell me why you're not the problem. You know what I mean? That's kind of what I got from it. But I think if you track sort of the way professional ministry has increased, you can also track the sort of inverse of that, the way community and the way parental teaching in the faith has sort of decreased. So we've made it a specialized field, right, where it's the professional's job, and I don't have to do it at home any longer. But even if we're like really, really great at what we do, and we do a really bang up job, we see our students, we see young adults, we see even people in our congregations in the pews, maybe 2 hours a week, maybe 3, maybe 4 if we're really lucky. Whereas students are spending so much more time at home, right? Young adults are spending so much more time with their families. And that's really where formation has to occur primarily, right? Is within the home, within families. And I think we've done a poor job of equipping families to really be in ministry with their children, and that goes from little kids all the way up to young adults and beyond. Because if you think about where life happens, right? Life doesn't happen at church. You go to church to be at church, right? And to learn and to do all those things, but life happens outside of the church walls for the most point, or for the most part. And I think it helps if you have people that are equipped to say, mom and dad are going through a divorce at home, right? What does that mean for you and your relationship with God? And let's work through this. Or, you have tons of homework and you're a high performing kid. What does that mean? Or you got cut from the soccer team. What does that mean? And, how is God active in that? And so you need to train people to have eyes that see and ears to hear, basically, of how God is active in those times. And we do that the best we can to equip people at church, but most of that formation has to take place at home. Churches have to be very intentional about integrating everything, that your children's ministry is connected to your youth ministry in some way, and that your youth ministry is connected to your young adult ministry or college ministry, and that your Sunday school classes on a Sunday morning, that have been the same people for 50 years, right, are maybe bringing in some younger faces and some younger people and saying this is how the youth group connects with, right, our Sunday school hour kind of thing. And so you have to be very, very intentional about it. It's a challenge and it's hard. That's why it hasn't been done very well. But that I think is where we need to look to really integrate holistically.
Right, and it is integration. We've heard that word before, and it's not just let's plop in the token young adult, or let's make sure we insert the token youth in the worship service, or make sure we have a children's moment so that the kids are seen in worship. It's how are those people participating in those ministries and being active agents in the church for God, for the community, and then it's important to get them involved in that way. Because when you do, actively engage a child in worship, then they're more likely to understand and come back and, be a participant in worship, which leads to, them being an active young adult and an active adult, and
And a lot of this, like we said, comes from Kinnaman's research, and his research shows that, students who are involved in worship, students that are in leadership positions, and that their gifts or talents are being used on a regular basis, much more likely to come to church after they graduate than students that aren't involved, aren't engaged in the church at large. And there's some sort of research out there that says that we do students a disservice sometimes by saying you should come to youth group and youth Sunday school and that's it, right?
Right. And I think that leads to this idea of accountability and how we have the congregation, members of congregation have a responsibility to either both hold families accountable and hold themselves accountable for helping children and youth and young adults come into the full life of the church. So how do we do that? How do we hold one another accountable to raising children, our children, the congregation's children? How do we hold them accountable to making sure that they're developing that faith?
Yeah, I think it's an important point, right? That when we're baptized into the whole body, and so your neighbor's children become your children because we're the family of Christ now, as opposed to individual families. And so it's really important that we keep that in mind, that those children are in fact our children, and so we're all responsible for each other. And to keep each other accountable is a challenge, certainly, because you don't want to look like. We have this paranoia, I think, a lot of times in our society that we're going to be seen as overstepping our bounds, or that we're going to be sticking our nose in where it doesn't belong, which sometimes happens in churches. I don't know if you know that or not.
Really?
But that's what we're called to keep each other accountable. We're called to keep each other accountable, in scriptural witness and through Christ as well. As far as how to do it, that's a tougher question. I think just to build within churches the culture that we are indeed accountable to one another, and that pastors are really intentionally looking for the places in congregations where people are being accountable and are holding one another accountable and really highlighting that and saying, this is how it's done. This is how it's done in love, and to really emphasize that point and say this is what you should be doing as well. Yeah. And it takes, I think, just a few strong people to build that culture. A few people that really buy into that idea and begin really nurturing that culture in other people, and then I think it kind of grows from there.
Yeah. So, I mean, it seems like it's kind of a relationship type thing. I mean, you can't go up to somebody who you don't have a relationship with and say,
exactly.
Why were you not in church the last 4 Sundays? Like, that might be sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, right? Yeah. But it is developing that relationship with someone to say, I missed you. Like, you haven't been here for a while, and I'm concerned. I really appreciate when you're here, or whatever it may be. And then, to take that to a young adult level, it's even more pivotal because young adults want to be noticed, And so what are some maybe tips or something how do you show a young adult you're interested and hold them accountable to being there without, pushing them away?
Yeah. I think space for a young adult to speak and to be heard is really important. And going back to Kinnaman again, he talks about reverse mentoring, and that young adults don't want to wait on the sidelines to take over once this current generation sort of moves into retirement or away from leadership. They want to do things now. And so I think to really highlight and search for the ways that young adults can contribute. And that goes on a bigger church scale of where can we utilize their gifts, but also on a one-on-one relationship scale of like, what can I learn from you? Where are you in your life that maybe I can learn something from your path or your questions or whatever it might be. So I think that young adults just really want a space to ask questions and to be heard. And I think one of the biggest ways to turn off a young adult, being one myself, is to say immediately, well, I know what you mean, or I know what you're going through, or this is my experience, and just really jump in with your 2 cents right away. When I think a lot of young adults just really want to have a voice heard and say, this is what I'm feeling, experiencing. And there will come a time probably where that older adult can say, well, I've been through this before, and let me tell you what I did. But to start with that, I think really turns a lot of young adults off, because we like to at least feel like we're being heard.
Yeah. So you commented that for young adults, having someone kind of insert their experience on top of their own is kind of off-putting. Do you have an illustration maybe that could help me understand that a little better?
Yeah, I mean, from a personal standpoint, a couple months ago, I went to see somebody for some advice professionally, and it was another pastor. And we sat down, and it was somebody I'd not actually really spoken to a lot before. It was just somebody that I called out of the blue and said, hey, can you help me with this? And so we sat down, and he asked me a question of like, what are you going through? What are you experiencing? And I sort of started into my experience, and it didn't take long for him to kind of jump in and say, well, as a pastor, this is what I do. And I found that to be kind of just off-putting, because part of reaching out was having a space to be heard, right? And just saying, this is what I'm experiencing, I just need to tell somebody about it. And I think if you look in Scripture, right, that's something that Jesus did really well. People talk about it being like a Socratic method of asking questions, but it's Christ-like is what it is. I mean, right. Jesus, when he approached people, encountered people, started with questions a lot of times. I mean, he asked the Samaritan woman, where's your husband, right? He asked the disciples, like, why are you concerned about what you're going to wear? And he started a lot of times with just that question and allowed people to speak for themselves, first of all, but also sort of draw out within themselves thinking, well, why am I concerned about that? And then use that opportunity to speak into their life. But he allowed them to process a little bit more before really kind of putting his own experience or his own advice on top of that. And I think that's an attitude that we should all have towards one another in the church, but especially when you talk about across generations.